Welcome back to Generation Sick, the power, politics, and propaganda behind America's health crisis. Written by Dr. Vic Naumov. Copyright 2016. All rights reserved. Last episode, we stepped into the exam room and asked some uncomfortable questions about what a real conversation with your doctor might sound like. Today, we're covering chapters 9 and 10. And this episode has one of the most interesting twists in the whole book. The man who actually designed the blueprint behind Hillarycare and Obamacare doesn't even like the system he helped create. Let's get into it. Dr. Naumov opens Chapter 9 with a quote from Dr. W.A. Evans, a former Chicago health commissioner, speaking at the American Medical Association's annual convention all the way back in 1911. Evans told his fellow physicians, in his words, "The profession cannot afford to have these places occupied by other than medical men." End quote. Dr. W.A. Evans. Dr. Naumov uses that century-old quote to set up a story about how thoroughly the medical profession has worked, generation after generation, to keep control of the public conversation around health policy. And nowhere is that more visible, he argues, than in the strange journey of Stanford economist Alain Enthoven's managed competition theory. The same theory we traced back in Episode 3, all the way from a private think tank in Wyoming. Here's where the story gets interesting. In February of 1992, President George H.W. Bush tried to get ahead of the healthcare debate by proposing his own managed competition plan, built largely on Enthoven's work. Bill Clinton, who'd originally favored a more direct approach using price controls, found himself under attack as a big government socialist. So, in a move that tells you a lot about how little daylight actually separates these plans, Clinton adopted the Republicans' own managed competition framework as his campaign platform. Once elected, Clinton handed the project to his wife. Hillary Clinton and her policy team consulted with the same Jackson Hole Circle and major insurance lobbyists we discussed back in Episode 3, and produced a bill running 1,342 pages, a bill that, in Dr. Naumov's telling, satisfied almost nobody and nearly derailed both her husband's administration and her own political future. One of Hillarycare's sharpest critics in 1993 was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would later become Hillary Clinton's own predecessor and political sponsor in the U.S. Senate. Moynihan pushed back hard on the plan's proposal to cut the number of doctors by 25% and the number of specialists in half. His response was blunt. If you have fewer doctors, you have fewer doctor bills, but you don't associate it with improving medicine. End quote. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But here's the detail Dr. Naumov really wants you to sit with. Alain Enthoven, the architect whose 1977 plan for Jimmy Carter eventually morphed first into Hillarycare, then into Obamacare, hated a lot of what politicians actually did with his own theory. In 1993, Enthoven wrote that Hillarycare, in his words, threatens to be a monopolistic, regulatory government agency that will cause more problems than it solves. End quote. Alain Enthoven. He went even further, suggesting Congress should simply delete the entire 1,342 pages of Clinton's bill and start over. Now, Enthoven wasn't a consistent critic of every healthcare expansion. He actually supported George W. Bush's Medicare prescription drug plan, which notably did not allow the federal government to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. Enthoven's reasoning was pragmatic. Drug manufacturers, he argued, needed strong profit margins to fund the next generation of research and development, and a monopolist supplier could simply refuse to sell a medication if the price were forced too low. But years later, once Obamacare itself finally passed, Enthoven's frustration came roaring back, this time aimed squarely at the system that bore his own theoretical fingerprints. He wrote candidly about what he called the enormous power of what he termed the medical-industrial complex, its lobbying armies and financial contributions blocking any serious effort at cost containment. His verdict on the Affordable Care Act was blunt. The American people are being deceived. End quote. Alain Enthoven, his argument was that the law did little or nothing to actually control healthcare spending, and he worried that letting costs keep climbing unchecked would eventually drive up interest rates and balloon the federal deficit. And to be clear, Dr. Naumov notes, Enthoven wasn't sparing Republicans either, criticizing what he saw as their own lack of fiscal seriousness and pointing to fear-based rhetoric like talk of so-called death panels as proof that neither party was approaching the actual cost problem honestly. Dr. Naumov's point in walking through all of this is almost ironic in the best sense of the word. The very person most responsible for inventing the theoretical foundation underneath nearly 50 years of American healthcare reform has spent decades publicly disowning what politicians actually built with his ideas. That's not exactly the kind of origin story you'd expect for a piece of legislation as celebrated or as controversial as Obamacare. Dr. Naumov also uses this chapter to dig into a much darker chapter of American policy history, the so-called Rockefeller drug laws, signed into law in New York State in the 1970s under Governor Nelson Rockefeller. These laws imposed extremely harsh, long mandatory minimum prison sentences for drug offenses, modeled on a zero-tolerance approach Rockefeller borrowed from Japan. The numbers that followed are sobering. The United States now incarcerates more people than any other country on Earth, and the enforcement of these laws fell disproportionately on poor Black and Hispanic communities, even though drug use crossed every demographic line. Other states, including California, later adopted similarly harsh mandatory sentencing and three-strikes laws of their own. Dr. Naumov also brings up a genuinely contested piece of research here, the controversial argument, popularized by the best-selling book Freakonomics, that the dramatic crime decline of the 1990s may have been connected to expanded access to legal abortion roughly 2 decades earlier. It's worth being clear that this remains a heavily debated claim among economists and criminologists, not settled fact, and Dr. Naumov raises it as one competing explanation for falling crime rates, set against Rockefeller's own preferred explanation, which credited his tough sentencing laws. Dr. Naumov also briefly acknowledges, without getting into the specifics, that the book draws on some genuinely extreme and widely disputed sources when discussing the deeper history of pharmaceutical and government power, including a 1980s-era author whose broader body of work has been criticized as deeply conspiratorial. Dr. Naumov is careful to separate the more grounded, documented parts of that critique, concerns about FDA regulatory capture, pharmaceutical industry lobbying, and drug company influence over public health policy, from the far more extreme and unverified claims layered on top of it elsewhere in that author's writing, which this audiobook does not endorse or repeat. That brings us to Chapter 10, Monopoly Healthcare, where Dr. Naumov widens the lens even further, looking at the network of institutions and individuals that grew out of the original Rockefeller philanthropic project. When John D. Rockefeller first agreed to his advisor Frederick Gates's plan to expand his influence through philanthropy, Dr. Naumov reminds us, he was the richest man in the world, with only a handful of true peers, men like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Henry Ford. Today, Dr. Naumov argues, economic power is arguably even more concentrated, carried forward by institutions these men either founded or inspired. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the modern banking and pharmaceutical giants that dominate the healthcare landscape now. Dr. Naumov traces how Rockefeller philanthropy helped identify and fund some of the most consequential scientific minds of the 20th century. Physicist Hans Bethe, who went on to lead the theoretical division at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, was one beneficiary. So was a young Henry Kissinger, who worked from 1956 to 1958, directing a Rockefeller Brothers Fund research project on American foreign policy, before going on to become National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Physicist Edward Teller, often called the father of the hydrogen bomb, was another figure whose work intersected with this same Rockefeller-funded scientific network, and who later helped inspire Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. Dr. Naumov's broader argument in laying out this network isn't that any single person secretly controls everything. It's that a remarkably small, interconnected set of institutions, built up over more than a century, continues to shape the boundaries of what counts as acceptable policy in America, healthcare very much included. From there, Dr. Naumov pivots to something every listener has almost certainly experienced firsthand: the bewildering opacity of a modern medical bill. A simple vaccination, he points out, can generate a bill of $500 or more. In a hospital setting, ordinary items that might cost $1 at a corner pharmacy can show up on a bill marked up by a factor of 100 or more. Pages and pages of tiny print packed with acronyms that often only a medical biller or a physician can fully decode leave most patients with little real ability to question or dispute the charges they're handed. And he draws a sharp connection here between medical debt and the broader financial system. Unpaid medical bills get reported to credit agencies just like any other debt, which means a healthcare bill you couldn't understand and couldn't afford to challenge can end up affecting your ability to buy a home, get approved for a loan, or qualify for a new job. Dr. Naumov's point is that this isn't some unfortunate side effect of an otherwise well-functioning system. It's a structural feature of a system where billing complexity itself has become a profit center. He closes the chapter looking ahead at where this trend seems to be heading, toward deeper integration of automated technology and artificial intelligence into medical diagnosis, billing, and treatment. He references IBM's early experiments with AI-assisted diagnosis as one example of where the field was already heading, and raises a fair question worth sitting with. As more of these decisions get handed over to algorithms and automated systems, who exactly is accountable when something goes wrong? And who benefits when a process becomes too complex for the average patient to meaningfully question? That's the through line Dr. Naumov wants to leave you with from chapters 9 and 10. Even the original architect of the system has publicly disowned what it became. And the deeper you look into the institutions and incentives behind modern healthcare billing, the clearer it becomes that complexity itself, confusing bills, inscrutable codes, automated decision-making, isn't a flaw in the system. In Dr. Naumov's view, it may be one of the system's most profitable features.
That's it for episode 6
Of Generation Sick. If today's episode left you looking at your last medical bill a little differently, that's worth paying attention to. In the next episode, we keep moving forward. If you want to be there when it drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And if today's episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how we restore the power to the people, one listener at a time.
I'm narrating
Generation Sick by Dr. Vic Naumov. I'll see you in episode 7.